Hi, I'm Miriam Kelly, Curator at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne. It's my pleasure to welcome you to ACCA's 2021 lecture series, Experimental Institutionalism, Contemporary Art and Curatorial Ecologies. As always, I would like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations as custodians of the land on which ACCA is located. I extend my respects to elders past, present and future, and to all First Nations people tuning into this program. After the richness of our Contemporary Exhibition History series, which is now available on podcast and video at acca.melbourne, we conceived of the 2021 annual lecture series to pose these broad questions. Where are we now and what's next? Across 7 different topics, this lecture series delves into an array of contemporary practices and projects. Artists, curators, writers, museum workers, lawyers, and educators discuss their work as it intersects with wider economic, technological, environmental, and political contexts in our radically changing times. Bringing together international and Australian speakers in each session, we also wanted to encourage global dialogues at a time of limited movement. In this series, we hear how similarities and alliances can be drawn across borders, and how we can work and learn differently in response to the specificities of locality, place, culture, and community. For the 5th dialogue in our series, titled Electronic, Modelling the Digital Present and Tools for the Future, I'm thrilled to be joined by 2 immensely creative and inspiring individuals, Seb Chan, who joins me from Melbourne, and Sahej Rahal, who's speaking with us from Mumbai. Seb Chan is Chief Experience Officer at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, ACME. Seb is responsible for a holistic, multi-channel, visitor-centred design strategy for ACME, and we'll hear today about some of the hybrid initiatives that have been integrated into the museum experience following ACME's reopening this year. Prior to ACME, Seb was Director of Digital and Emerging Media at CooperHewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York. There, he also led the museum's digital renewal and its transformation into an interactive, playful new museum, for which he and his team won multiple awards. Sahej Rahal's installations, films, performances, artificial intelligence works, and games draw upon sources ranging from mythology to science fiction. Sahej will speak to the cycles of past and present as they relate to myth, belief, and information technology, and as they intersect with the current political landscape in India. Sahej has presented work in major solo and group projects internationally over the past decade, including recently as part of the 2020 Transmediale Festival, the 2019 Liverpool Biennial, and here with us at ACCA also in 2019. Sahej is also the recipient of the Jungé Academy's 2020 Human Machine Fellowship and the 2020-2021 Digital Earth Fellowship. Seb, Sahej, thank you so much for joining me. I'll hand over to you to speak further about the work that each of you do in navigating the digital present and considering our possible futures.
So I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the kind of traditional owners of the land on kind of which I create, live, and work. The Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past to present. I'd also like to acknowledge that the work that I'm speaking about now is actually work of many teams and colleagues that I've worked with across many museums and also design firms and consultants and more. This is always collaborative work. So I'm going to talk today about really this sort of career kind of journey of the last kind of 20 years and the tensions that technology has brought to the museum space, the tensions between user and artist, museum and gallery, and this sort of this shift of the use of technology as a democratic and social change tool to one that is much more complicated now. I start with a series of six premises. The first one of these is the museum now in 2021 or the 2020s is now a platform for communities, creators and artists. And I think this begs the question: if kind of the museum is a platform, the big question is who it is a platform for. Premise two is that of course the museum and gallery was never a sort of neutral frame. Neither was the sense of the white cube gallery, and that people need to spend extended time with creative works in order to be affected by them. I think that's one of the really interesting things in technology, and certainly one of the things that my work has tried to really push on is this sense of how kind of might technologies allow visitors or the communities that museums and galleries serve to spend more time with the creative works. Premise four is that networked digital technologies have had and continue to have pervasive effects on our communities, and that is something that I think we've become super aware of in the last five years. And thus, these same technologies do transform the museum, and also the type and nature of creative kind of works created by artists and makers. And if kind of the museum, of course, in premise 6 doesn't adapt, communities can kind of now create their own museum kind of like structures to store and to keep memories and to share them with others. So in the first kind of decade of this century, most of kind of my work was spent on opening up collections, making social histories accessible to various communities, and also contestable. And this is when I was working at the Powerhouse Museum, and this wasn't just about making these freshly digitized collections available on kind of the web, but actually using that as a way for communities to interact with and to almost reclaim these collections that had been collected by the museum. So here in 2005, this is a very early version of the then Powerhouse Museum's collection website. This really, when this launched, it and the Brooklyn Museum's collection on the web were the two collection websites around the world that inspired many other museums to think about the way they presented collections. So this was a museum collection website that had tagging, semantic analysis, related works, lots of images, all of those sorts of things. And interestingly, this generated a huge amount of community feedback. So people would look at this website, maybe they'd done a search for something they'd found in their shed, and they would email the Powerhouse, because the Powerhouse had the only record for that sort of thing on the web at that time. So that was kind of exciting. And then towards the end of that decade, augmented reality started to emerge with the arrival of the smartphone, and the iPhone 3 kind of GS, I think, was the first in Australia. And by 2009, we were working with some tools on a platform called Layar, and working with a local Sydney firm called Mob Labs to create this app that allowed museum users to browse the museum's collection of historic photographs of Sydney by going to the locations where those photographs had been taken. So in a way, returning those images from the past to their locations in kind of the present. Now that doesn't seem so amazing now, but back in 2008-9, that felt like something magical. In 2011, I moved to kind of New York to work for the Smithsonian, the CooperHewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. They were going through a major redevelopment, and this was a period where we were thinking a lot about the way the smartphone had changed the way people had begun to visit museums. So this was the National Museum of Design in America. So it had a lot of porcelain ceramics, it had posters, it had products. It had this very, very large collection, but a collection that even in a redeveloped building, only a fraction of which could ever be put out on a public show. And there was a sense that we knew that by the time this big redevelopment project had finished, I had arrived and the museum had just closed, and the museum was planned to be closed for a couple of kind of years. That by kind of the time the museum's collection, the museum rebuild had been done, the museum's collection would all, or should have all been kind of digitized. So building a new collection website for the museum, and then this provocation of, if everything had been digitized and on the museum's website, how might we design the building experience for kind of visitors? How might that change? And so, what the smartphone had done, of course, is bring user experience and the sense of control of the user to the fore. So the sense of museums started to open up their ability for visitors to take photographs within their galleries. A couple of years previous, of course, people would still be stopped by kind of security guards for taking the photographs in exhibitions. That seems ridiculous now, but that certainly was a thing in the early 2000s. But by 2010, 2011, 2012, most museums were allowing that. Anyway, so how might we begin to change the way we designed exhibition spaces and experiences to lean into this sense of these collection records being available on the website, and how, as a result of that, might sort of we bring friction in kind of to the visiting experience of a museum, to slow people down, to really play up the sense of being present physically with things from a museum's collection, works of art, works of kind of design, and then also use the sense that those works were also digitized, and then allow visitors to go home and look at them differently later on. So we made, with a couple of design firms, this thing, or a magic wand, and it was really based on this sort of sense of a magic kind of library card, which would allow you to move through the museum and collect works of kind of design to look at later on. So this is with working with a local firm in New York at the time, Local Projects. Local Projects came up with this idea in 2012, and this is from their original pitch. Their original pitch deck to the museum was this sort of sense of, could we give visitors to the design museum a pen, and that pen would then allow visitors to become designers and also take home things from the collection with them. Of course, building a physical product, we worked with a firm in Spain and many other product kind of designers to build a physical device. So this really brought a lot of challenges around building a physical product at a time when these, batteries, cleanliness, how is it better than a smartphone? How actually does it work? How kind of do visitors realize what kind of to do? All of that sort of thing became really key issues for us. And this is it running in 2015. So this is the CooperHewitt experience then. You would move through the galleries with this wand, collecting things, bring them back to big interactive tables, explore them in more detail, be able to create and draw your own designs, and then take home 3D models of kind of those kind of designs at that time to perhaps print on your school or university's 3D printer, which was pretty cool. Similarly, the CooperHewitt had this amazing collection of historic wallpapers, and wallpapers are difficult things to show in museums, because museums collect them as swatches or little strips. And of course, seeing them requires you to see them in a room. So seeing you surrounded by these historic patterns changes your mood and the way a room feels. So being able to use projection to allow people to get a sense of how a wallpaper would feel was really, really critical. And this also allowed, we really leant into the sense of giving visitors the tools to create their own wallpaper designs. And that became immensely popular. And again, really lent into that sense of becoming a kind of designer. So the wallpaper room, super exciting and super fun and super also photogenic. So that sort of sense of people coming to the physical space of the museum to use digital tools to put themselves and their own creativity in kind of to the museum. In the first year of operation, about 4 million things throughout the museum were collected, and nearly 30% went back to the museum's website, logged in, and looked at what they'd collected or made. But most importantly, the type of person, the age of person who came to that museum on the Upper East kind of side of New York radically changed. The age of visitors halved. And that I think was really important, putting the sort of sense of the design museum back in kind of the hands of the next sort of generation of creative practitioners was super important. So here at Melbourne, at the National Museum of Screen Culture, a similar issue, in many ways, being a museum that needs to display, collect and preserve new types of art and media. And these are often also now digital works. So this work on the top kind of left, Daniel Crook's, an amazing work, Phantom kind of the Bride, 2-screen production, Zandy Begg's work on the top right, which generates different sequences for a documentary about Juanita Nielsen in a kind of solved crime case in Sydney in the 1970s. Terranolius, Soderbergh's classic mashup kind of work, which uses rotoscoping to create a collage of many, many different Australian films. And the work on the bottom kind of right, virtual reality work, which is in fact a virtual reality preservation of a virtual reality, of a technologically driven theatre production. So in the case of this museum, now the currency we are working is, of course, time, because the things we are about take time to watch or play, in the case of video games, and the time of experience. And the museum's physical site is a place where you would never have time to watch everything. So very early on in the redesign, we're working with a New Zealand-based designer, David Hebblethwaite, at a firm called Art of Fact. There was this real notion of building on the work done in New York with the pen, the sense in terms of a museum of media, the sense that you could collect and take home the films, TV and video games was really obvious and super important. And the value of the museum, as you can see here in the technology drawings of a visitor journey, perhaps was to point out the connections between things. You can see perhaps on the left here, on the wall, someone is searching and browsing all of these scenes related to cats. And this was, of course, in 2016, the sort of sense of using computer vision and AI to pull out sequences from the museum's archival collections to find automated connections between works was super interesting. Of course, working with a US firm in the exhibition design second kind of story. Here's one of their master plan pieces where they are explicitly drawing out the sense of visitors in a visitor journey throughout this future museum at that time. explicitly drawing out the amount of time spent on each kind of floor and the way people might move between floors and spend time with different types of experiences in different places within the physicality of the institution itself. That, of course, the lens evolved, and it evolved from a single use but returnable, bit like the pen that you would use it, borrow it, use it, give it back, into working with Swinburne's Centre for Design Innovation. We turned that into a recyclable tool. So the lens evolves, and it was this sort of, the lens was really nice because it also had this metaphor of a lens allowing you to focus and see things in a new way. So it had that sort of nice, snappy metaphor there. The lens physically was then redesigned based on these phenakistoscopes, these early 19th century toys that really the precursor to the animated animated GIF. And here you can see another early prototype from second cut story of these being see-through, transparent things. That's not how they turned out in the end with physical prototyping and this sort of desired fiction approach of imagining different possible futures. We ended up with the lens as it is today, which is like this. So I think what's interesting about where the lens finished up was this sort of sense of the lens being used as a physical device within the museum to move kind of through the physical space of kind of the museum as you build up a collection. And that collection, in fact, becomes the start point rather than the end point of your exploring of a universe of content. So that last sequence of that video, the visitors at the end of the permanent exhibition or the free exhibition come to a series of interactive tables where they connect their lens, and their lens then draws out connections that our curators have made to other films, TV, and video games that they may want to go home and watch. So not only do you get the things that you collected, but the things you have collected are also then connected by humans, not AI, to other things the museum is making recommendations for. And what's interesting in the interface for that experience, which is in the gallery, is that those recommendations are with little stories of why X is connected to Y, with a named curator beneath each. So you know who is recommending what kind of to you and why. So that sort of transparency of curation, I think, does open up this contestability for the museum, this sort of sense that the museum's recommendations are then named and contestable, which for me was very important from a standpoint of the politics of curation and the politics of the museum experience being foregrounded. Of course, you then go home, you log on, and you keep watching and playing. So the sense of the museum's visit is then extended not only from the time you spend within the museum, but also to the home itself. Now, this is done pseudo-anonymously, so we're trying to reduce as much as possible in this particular age of surveillance capitalism. We don't want to feed a beast here. Your information and data is safe and pseudo-anonymized, but we still have this challenge around the success being measured in quantified ways. So we can say in 2.1 million things have been collected by our visitors, which is a very significant volume of things, and we know that a fifth of visitors log on and look at what they've seen. That's really great. We're really pleased by that. But I think the challenge is this sort of sense of how do you resist the quantification of success here? That these figures are very, very, very impressive or look impressive, but it's really the qualitative stories, the interviews we do with kind of visitors, the emails we get, or the social media posts that we get of visitors who said, "Oh, I got recommended this because I collected that, and I went home and watched it, and I really enjoyed it," or I never thought I'd be interested, or I'd see the relationship between this and that really starts to draw out the kind of value there. But I think, this is also about creating these moments where the museum is the beginning of further discussions about screen culture. It sort of is, as I've said in the past, the museum is a curiosity machine, that it's a machine that's generating more curious people, more curious citizens. And that's probably a really good place to stop. So thanks heaps.
Thank you to Miriam and also Seb for inviting me to this conversation. And Seb, it was really interesting to see how your approach to sort of moving between all these sort of timelines and worlds is like kind of coming together, and just one really exciting thing that I felt in your approach was, you've got this idea of so this is my favorite sort of aspect of going to a museum is, encountering things by chance, by, this kind of, you enter this unknown space where you don't know what you'll find. And that to me, I mean, like kind of somehow overrides that, or doesn't override, like, I mean, it sits with, museums and their history and like the way these objects are codified and things like that. But at the same time, you end up like, going into a museum and still finding things that, are new or, you haven't kind of encountered before. And I feel like, the Lens project that you presented kind of carries that in a way, like, there's this, and something really, something that I identify with, like in your approach was, this resistance to quantifying experience, and instead letting the multitude to sort of flow through both of the museum space and the viewer. That is, I think, there's a lot in that in those two unsaid kind of spaces that that's a space of poetry, and it's really refreshing and like beautiful to see you kind of bring that into your approach to sort of museum making. So with that, and like I'd like to just kind of give you a sense of like what I do. So I'm an artist. I live in Mumbai, and I create sculptures, objects, toys from this kind of alternate civilization that's sort of unfolding into our universe. And what's happening is that these objects kind of take their shape from things that I find by chance, So it's almost like this kind of little museum journey that I'm doing in across Bombay. And Bombay is kind of a museum in a way, it's this museum as bricolage where it's kind of reformulating itself constantly every night, and you never know what it'll throw at you. So that's kind of been my sort of approach in creating this kind of fictional world of like, creatures and shamans and ghosts and, and then they take the shape of like performances and installations. And now I was thinking, what if these creatures that I'm creating, what if they can actively play a role in sort of shaping the world that's kind of coming together in some way. And that's what kind of drove me to working with AI, and the interesting thing about AI is this new technology is that it kind of occupies the space between being a tool and being a kind of potential collaborator in a way as well, and it's almost sort of between those two spaces, where and I think that kind of field that it opens up in being these two things at the same time, it kind of allows for almost this, the multitude of sort of non-human intelligence and the history of non-human intelligences that have kind of walked with us through history to sort of enter into that conversation of art making. So that's kind of what drew me to AI. And just a little disclaimer, I don't work with any kind of sophisticated sort of AI program. I work with just video game AI, so characters or creatures that are driven by that you have in video games, non-player characters. So that's the kind of basic level sort of scripts that I work with, and they're not machine learning or anything like that. But they are capable of some fun things. So the way I work is I create these kind of large sort of creatures again that kind of look like my analog or real life meat space sculptures, and sort of attach these scripts to each of their limbs, and their virtual limbs, and these limbs then kind of have essentially these sort of protean minds of their own, right? And they produce motion through chaos, through kind of just colliding against each other in a way, figuratively speaking. Right now, these scripts are also capable of listening. So what happens here is that the viewer and any noise or sound or music that we make would kind of interrupt the motion and change the way that the creatures sort of interact within these virtual kind of biomes that they inhabit. And one of the ideas that was kind of also driving this approach to non-human intelligence was and to this idea of the post-human was how would we speak to the future? How would we speak to that which comes after us? Or and that's kind of the dialogue essentially that's being orchestrated between the AI programs on one side and human beings who are sort of encountering them. The program that I showed at ACCA in the before times, before the pandemic, was called Antral, and it's this sentient musical instrument that produces music, or this procedurally kind of modulating drone that changes in response to external kind of audio feedback. Right. So now I was sort of building these creatures, and then I somehow kind of encountered this this ancestor in a way to these creatures in this guy called King Bhojadev, who was we'll call him the Maharaja of machines. So Bhojadev was a king during the Paramara dynasty in India. And he was, sort of this philosopher king, and he sort of put together this tome on, sort of deliberating on everything from painting, sculpture, war strategies, very kind of existential sort of questions, and it was sort of put together in this book called the Samarangana Sutradhara. And now there's this one very interesting part of the book called the Yantra Vidhanam. So it's about I think there's a good chunk of verses in the book that are titled under the Yantra Vidhanam, And the Yantra Vidhanam specifically looks at machines. Now, the word Yantra means is machine or tool, in that sense, and or instrument. And it comes from yam. The root word is yam, and it's sort of comparable to, the sort of root word of cybernetics, kerberos, the Greek origin. So yam is to control, and then you get yantra. Now, what Bhojadev does is like he kind of makes a list of these perfect yantras, like, what would be a good yantra, like what are the virtues of a good yantra, and they sort of go from durability and freedom from tightness, freedom from looseness. He also says inscrutability. And one really kind of fascinating idea that he sort of applies onto them is an ability to work in an atmosphere of uncertainty, right? This caught my eye. And the second way in which he sort of like, kind of categorizes them is that there are machines or yantra that are, that require external propulsion. There are machines that are propelled by hidden mechanisms. And then there are machines that are self-propelling, right? Okay, now you take these self-propelling machines on one side, and you take the ability to act under conditions of uncertainty on the other. And essentially what you have is non-human sentient organisms, right? Like that are capable of driving themselves and responding to the chaos that surrounds them. This was quite fascinating because, like, presently, especially the way we see, like how we imagine AI, especially in like the popular imagination of artificial intelligence is this efficiency enhancing, tool. In Google Maps or things like that, it'll give you the perfect journey, from one place to the other. It will like give you the fastest route or something like that. In matchmaking apps like Tinder, it'll find you the perfect partner. So there's this that narrative kind of exists, and then like when we look at AI and governance, there's this idea of efficiency that like if you were just to hand over governance to artificial intelligence programs, they would sort of fix humanity's problems. So there's this idea of efficiency, right? And this is something that I feel is, with that idea of efficiency, you have a kind of normativity that is like, that multitude that is capable of, say, even encountering objects that it might not have in a museum space, is kind of collapsed into a very singular kind of idea of the human, and that those contours of that the human that is being framed even in that rhetoric is exclusionary, right? Like because so what I found interesting in, say, Bhojadev's conception or these kind of propositions that he's making was like he's kind of actually drawing these machines or sort of like walking with them towards uncertainty, towards contingency, towards chance. And that is also like, just looking at the space that we are in presently, we are kind of in essentially this game of chance, right? Like you don't know how, or because there's this like kind of all-encompassing, non-human organism that has kind of like sort of permeated every aspect of our lives. So you don't know if you will encounter, the virus while you go to the shopping mall, or like to get your groceries, or even if you kiss someone, and so there's that kind of it's kind of in the air again. In more ways than one, right? Right. So if we find ourselves in these spaces of contingency and in these games of chance, and that kind of got me thinking about gambling. Because gamblers are living their lives by chance, and that is sort of their coda. So now most gamblers I've spoken to are kind of they're kind of boring people because they have this sort of unsaid kind of like discipline. It's very austere in a way that they so serious gamblers, they will tell you that in order to sort of, properly attune yourself to the sort of machinery of chance and luck, you need to kind of exorcise yourself of hope and despair, right? And you cannot sort of allow yourself those to fall to those sort of, or allow yourself those emotions. Only then can you kind of attune yourself to, perfectly to chance. And the moment you sort of start believing that the luck that has come your way is, you're deserving of it, then you've lost the game. So it kind of puts you on your it puts you on the game board in a really interesting way, I feel. Another kind of place in which we see chance playing out, especially in India right now, on the borders of Delhi, is at the farmers' protest, which has sort of been it began with the Sikh agitation, and then now there's farmers from all over the world all over the country who have gathered there, and it is actually the largest gathering for like in human history. And what's interesting over here is that the way that the farmers are organizing is kind of driven by this idea that was actually sort of I guess imagined by this Sikh poet called Harinder Singh Mehboob, who speaks about this idea of Khalis Kudrat, which is absolute nature. And he says that you have this force of absolute nature that is kind of driving something called Akal Fateh, which is Akal is that which lies outside of time, and Fateh is victory, right? So he says that Khalis Kudrat drives Akal Fateh, drives the untimely victory, which will be encountered when you cannot account for it, when you cannot prepare yourself for it. And that's interesting because these forces now lie outside of time on a metaphysical level. While on a material level, what you're seeing is that the Indian state is kind of like designing itself very much in that as time itself, so it is driven by this right-wing sort of ultra right-wing ideology of Hindutva, which kind of like imagines itself as Sanatan, which is to say it is time itself, it is the kind of order of time. And you see this playing out on the borders of Delhi as well, because you see concrete blocks and you see these massive kind of cargo containers and literally like stacked up like like a game of Tetris, and you see concertina lacing the horizon, and then you have this force of absolute nature that is kind of being driven, that is coming in from outside of time to kind of challenge it. So this is the kind of shape of contingencies that we swirl within, and yeah, it's interesting to say the least.
Thank you so much, both of you. Such inspiring and rich conversations. I'm so glad you can't see my desk at the moment is covered in notes and paper. But I have I just wanted to say it's such an amazing time to be listening to discussions when so much tech and digital development is focused on prediction and efficiency, to hear you both talk about challenging that in different ways in the creative process and in enabling people to encounter time in such different and wonderful ways. Seb, and Sahej, you touched on this too when you were responding to Seb's discussion. Something that jumped out at me immediately when you were talking about how exciting it is to see the numbers in the way that people are engaging, but how you were looking to kind of resist that. I was really curious, how do you measure the qualitative, or is that something that you try not to measure? Is measurement the wrong word to kind of consider that?
Yeah, I think measurement is the wrong word. I think it's observation and talking with people. I think one of the things that comes with a a design approach to this is to try to find ways that that describe the value better, and to realize that that value will change. I think the pre-COVID world, the value of what we were making is very different to the post-COVID world, or whatever stage we're in now. But yeah, the sort of sense that evolving with the projects, I think, has been really important, and having space to move. But, you know, I guess it is, as you know, the database and technology is quantifying, and that's really challenging. And I think one of the things of working with artists, but also approaching design and tech from a more humanistic perspective and being aware of those politics is absolutely key. And I think that's one of the things when these projects are deployed within museums or designed within museums, it's about it's about trying to bring friction back into the process. Rather, I think, as we've seen in our consumer applications that we do, from dating apps to, you know, Zoom and other things, everything's been about designing the friction out. And actually part of what I and people I work with try to do is design friction in, to see what other things come out as a result of that, what energy is created as a result of that.
Sahej, I can see you nodding wildly. I think designing the friction in is such a beautiful way to describe the way that you work. That work that you've presented at Transmedial, I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. I think that the seamlessness with which you bring history and future into one. There's a line which says something around mystic beliefs, depending on which shastras or which WhatsApp you're reading. And I think that sense of friction really comes to the fore in that work.
So yeah, like, you know, the idea of I actually loved it the way you phrased it. Like, you know, I thought designing with friction in is quite a nice like way of phrasing the approach, because you're sort of like essentially so the kind of larger discussion that's kind of playing out, like, you know, especially with, like, you know, planetary computation as well on one side, and, like, you know, the fact that we are capable of, like, computing and quantifying every aspect of human life in a certain way, is that you're bound to create limited models, and this is not to make some kind of, like, you know, apology for you know, some kind of vitalistic idea of, like, you know, that there's something essentially human or something like that. Sorry, I'm not so interested in, like, you know, kind of reaffirming the human, but I do think that just generally approach, you know, I mean, I see it in, like, so Bombay is the city of advertising, actually. Like, you know, it is kind of selling the Indian dream. It is the city of dreams. Like, you know, with both with Bollywood and with advertising, you see that, like, you know, just playing out on a daily basis on the street, in your conversations, things like that. Like, you know, it's all about creating hype and selling this idea of, you know, like, the American dream, I would say, is actually still alive in India in a really funny way. Anyway, now what's happening in that kind of in the way that, like, you know, design functions, and, like, design and advertising specifically is kind of interested in, like, you know, really quantifying things to the you know, molecular or, like, the organ level, in fact. So an example of this that I encountered recently was, like, a friend was describing how you know, they're getting data from people, like, you know, I mean, sort of focus groups for who are looking at advertisements and recording how long their eyes kind of, like, stay on the image, and, like, you know, how because your eye kind of, you know, sort of moves that way, right? Like, I mean, like, when you're kind of, like, looking at it, and how long does it stay in your field of view and things like that, and how and it's quantifying things on an organ level, and this has got nothing to do with who you are. Like, you know, this is scary because, like, the individual is reduced to just that eye movement on one side. In a scarier kind of, like, well, I wouldn't call it scary, but, like, another kind of conception of this is, let's just look at the I won't take too much time about this, but, like, let's take the Pegasus sort of expose that happened. Right now, in Pegasus, like, you can essentially, with Pegasus, you could kind of implant like, evidence into people's phones or into their laptops, like that, right? And and then use that to kind of create a case, put them on trial, etc., etc. At this point, you don't even need a dissident to the state anymore, right? Like, because you can conjure one. You can conjure an individual who is standing against the state. Like, the state has no, like, I mean, with surveillance capitalism or things like that, like, you still needed the individual to provide you data, right? Like, in the advertising case, for example, you still need the eye to move. But like with Pegasus, you don't really need an individual at all. You just need someone's phone somewhere. There's just, a phone needs to exist as a sort of relay point, essentially. There's no space for the individual over here. Like, and this is like the kind of nadir that this quantification kind of leads us to, where like you can atomize the individual entirely to the point that like it doesn't exist. Like, and where like each aspect of their life has been like quantified and reduced to like atoms, and it's gone. Like, now in response to that, when you kind of like I would say your playful kind of approach has chance and like kind of luck built into it, where it requires the individual to play into that space, and that's what we need. Like, that's the that's really beautiful. Like, we really kind of like yeah, it's the most beautiful thing I heard today morning, so it's quite nice. It's filling me with joy.
I like too the way that both of you have spoken about the interaction between technology and the physical. It plays out obviously very much in the museum experience and navigating how people are working and living and thinking about collections, but also, of course, Sahej, in your practice. I mean, in the pre-COVID times, probably primarily, but perhaps both of you could speak a little bit about navigating that, for want of a better word, hybrid experience of the digital and the physical.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, if we go back to pre-smartphone times, the sort of sense that there was a hybrid didn't really exist until the smartphone really came about and really took the sense of place out of the internet. I still remember, there was a computer at home you would log on to the internet through, and it was a place, it was, and all the metaphors we use were about place. And then when the smartphone comes around, particularly probably from 2010 onwards, the sort of it becomes very different and all pervasive, and all of those technologies that Sahej was talking about that track and atomize your identity, and also zoom out and make you part of other cohorts of similar or different identities. That all becomes possible very, very fast. And I think that the thing that was sort of lost was this sort of sense of the data literacy and all those other technical literacies could never keep up with that pace. And now with this sort of hybrid model, we've been living in that hybrid space for a decade plus now. Yet we don't quite understand where those borders are or how sort of porous they are now. And I think they bleed into our lives in ways we don't know and don't expect. I think the Pegasus examples really interesting, because that is, things being pushed into your space when they're not actually in your space, and that sort of sense of self, that the connection of your bodily self to the tools like the smartphone become very blurred too. But I think pandemic has, everybody talks about the hybrid museum. We talk about a multi-platform museum now at work, and yet we're still, we've launched a thing called Gallery 5, which is for net art and digital art. We have a Cinema 3. We have 2 physical cinemas. We have Cinema 3, which is our streaming service. They're still trying to find their place, for want of a better word. That I think the other thing that happens, of course, is that technology particularly in the last 20 years, is, the first mover advantage is very strong, and they seem to be winner takes all markets still. And, I think we're all trying to resist that. And I think small, we talk about our stuff as content, yet we wouldn't do that if we were talking about putting works of art in a public space. It was not content, it's an artwork. But once it moves onto a digital platform, it's content because it floats amongst all these other things. So I think we've got to sort of find new ways of describing the work we do. And that's a rambling answer, but maybe, I'm not sure where I'm going with that. Sahej.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of like sort of figuring the entire thing out as we go along, right? It's been an adventure, honestly. If I can make a video game kind of like plug, which I think everyone should play, if you have a system to run it. In 2019, this Japanese game designer who's like this genius comes up with these crazy surreal video games called for the longest time he's sort of redefined genres and things like that, and it's the closest thing I have encountered to a proper postmodern work of art is his games. So this guy called Hideo Kojima, and he in 2017-18 started his own game studio, and then made this game called Death Stranding. And Death Stranding actually just literally predicts the world that we're living in right now. Is this kind of and it's amazing because it's also extremely a boring game. The idea is you have to move parcels from one place to the other, but also kind of reconnect America, which is broken, and everything's kind of a really some of the metaphors are on the nose, they're sort of communication devices are handcuffs and things like that, but at the same time it's this really beautiful kind of game about just making connections, and that for me kind of really became even though we're in this place where we're going to be disconnected from the world, and from friends, from people we love, in this weird way, we're still going to be able to connect and communicate, and in really kind of mushy and cheesy ways, irrespective, because speaking and connecting is so ingrained and so human that it kind of defines us, so we will kind of find a way in really strange ways. I don't know how best to describe it, but yeah, that was kind of I feel that one game is actually a triumph of the entire ordeal. It's the one, okay, this work of art came out of this entire thing. It's quite cool. Anyway, but yeah, other than that, I do think that it's you're still figuring out how what kind of a risk can you take, for example. So a couple of friends and I, we set up a studio right in the middle of the second lockdown, which was I still don't know how we've kind of put it together, but it's standing, it's actually my oldest friends, from way back from school, and it all kind of, we'd gone our separate ways, and then we met and decided to set this thing up. And it's called Jadoo Ghar, the House of Magic. And interestingly, Jadoo Ghar was actually the name given to museums in the colonial era as well. There was these cabinet of curiosities. So anyway, we somehow made this space, and then now we are inviting people for film screenings and doing talks and just hanging out, and we're also being able to kind of work over there in really strange ways, so it's the thing is that you're constantly kind of navigating as you move forward, and I mean honestly I feel that this is kind of going to be the normal, this is, even if Corona goes away, the scary prospect is that this is just the first of many other sort of pandemics to unfold, Um, well, not it's not even the first. Like, it has unfolded in other parts of the world, and yeah, and like, we're sort of living on the brink of like climate catastrophe. So, like, I mean, if this is the extinction game, then let's play to the fullest. I would say, like, I mean, that's my approach at least. Like,
I mean, obviously the huge changes in terms of studio and approaches, no traveling, but has this period of time changed the way you work and are making work, the kinds of work you're making as well, Sahej?
Yeah, well, like, I mean, I like for the longest time, like, when I was actually like sort of scared of the pandemic, it like more than I am right now. Like, now it's sort of like an assessed risk order. I was like, basically, I just holed myself in like my old studio, and I was just working on my computer. Like, I was just making these AI programs and like a couple of drawings and things like that. And yeah, like slowly that kind of like, you start getting used to the fact that like, okay, you kind of take one step out, things like that. But yeah, like it's like my practice has majorly shifted to being digital in the last like 2 years. But now with this studio space, I've been able to like kind of get my hands on a little bit of clay and start playing with things again. So.
And Seb, relaunching a museum in the middle of the pandemic, what kinds of considerations were you going through?
I might just go back first to Sahej's point about Kojima's game. I think what was really fascinating about that game, and I think this is something that perhaps connects that to the work with the pen and now the lens, is the real physicality of that game. When you're climbing up that mountain that you've got to go up for literally hours and hours of game time before you build the quicker means of traversing the landscape. There's a real physicality to it, and I thought it was really interesting that a game that was so beautiful graphically also had that real sense of physicality to it, and that sense of physical strain. You're actually feeling your character Sam going up those mountains and going across those streams, and it wasn't, it was almost more physical than some of those other games that are explicitly physical, like the fitness games and things like that. I thought it was really fascinating. I think that sort of sense of multi-sensoriness was really interesting, and I don't know many other games that capture that. And I think that game, it's really interesting you bring it up, because it is one of those games that does feel more like an art exhibition piece than anything else, but it is also immensely part of the discourse around AAA video games. I mean, it's like Hollywood scale production and credits to match. Those credits go on for about 20 minutes at the end of it all. It's fascinating. But anyway, yeah. So opening the museum, I think it was interesting coming. We'd obviously never planned to open as late as we did, and certainly been closed. Midway through lockdown 2, I think we realized that this was going to go on for much longer than was initially thought, and we started to we launched the new brand and all these new digital initiatives, so Cinema 3, and a remake of the exhibition's themes, I guess, on the website as a sort of series of narrative essays with interactive elements to them and things like that. Launching a museum in this sort of time, I think is about, also asserting the value of the museum as a physical convening place, and then saying that that's not the end of it. I think that's really, for me, what has been really, I think progressive for the field, is that it's actually pushed museums to reconceive of their purpose as both ideas, collections, and convening spaces, and that sort of and what I would hope is that sense, I guess, that I was getting at in what I was saying, in talking through the work, is that sort of sense of impacting people across time. I think that was really one of the things that pre-COVID museums were quite complacent about. We often saw the internet as a thing about reach, but it was never about time. It was never about people spending more time with works or coming back to works or even commissioning new types of works that bridge the physical spaces of the galleries and the spaces in people's lives or places or the spaces in people's communities. And I think that opens up a really important piece around the relevance of museums, particularly as we move into addressing the climate crisis that will dominate the rest of the century. I think COVID's been almost a test run for can we collaborate at scale to solve global problems, and the reality is we're probably pretty bad at it, actually, and we need all the institutions we have and creative people we have to find ways to build collaborations across both physical spaces and across borders and time, because these issues are not easily solvable. Nothing ever is. So I think there's sort of I'm hopeful that the sort of multi-platformness will also be that sense of the museum becoming a platform for communities and for discussions. I think we've been through a period where galleries really shifted to being places for artists, which was great, but they really need to be a place for dialogue between artists and communities, and be places that realize that they have a power relationship with both artists and communities, and not sort of not see themselves as neutral spaces, but use their power to convene things in valuable ways.
Absolutely. Yep, I feel like that needs to be printed on a t-shirt for sure. That's incredible. Sahej, you spoke about AI and your use of AI, and this morning I got a survey to fill out about how museums use AI, and is our museum using AI? Seb, what's your museum's position, or your position on AI in museums?
Oh, it's funny. Even back at that early Powerhouse work that I was showing, in 2005-06, we were using what wasn't called AI then, but we're using text mining tools to build semantic maps across the language used by curators in writing descriptions of collections. And then obviously through the work at the CooperHewitt, we were looking at ways to algorithmically connect things and learn things. And during that period too, there was all that work that MIT was doing about emotion detection, and it's subsequently been shown to be on pretty thin ground, plus all the biases that are obvious to anybody that spends 20 minutes in the space doing things. I think it's been interesting to see how AI has become a buzzword for really what is statistics, and at one kind of level, but I think there's really interesting work going on at the generative level, and I think there's been really great work that artists have been doing and making that are sort of poking at the edges and trying to, I remember in my other life as a music person when there was a German musician who was making music out of skipping CDs. So Marcus Pop and his work Discount, I think in 1994. Anyway, it was the sound of skipping CDs, and it was sort of the birth of sort of, I guess, glitch in terms of music. And that sort of sense of AI now being used, artists working with AI to sort of poke at the edges and to reveal the glitches and the removing the opacity of the algorithm. And I think in our communities, our technical literacy is generally very poor. these sort of things are often seen as magic, but they're not magic at all. They're you know, mathematics, and and can be very, very reductive. You know, I mean, I will get an email every week at least of some new startup wanting to run predictive methods across our user data or whatever, or across, you know, predict how many people will do this. Sure, but you know, there's a whole lot of privacy concerns in that too. But also, you know, I think it's more interesting to see where these things begin to break kind of down, so our communities can resist that quantifying urge, and that you know, almost programmatic urge to program our societies, to engineer them into some frictionless future. Sounds pretty grim, really. That's why I really like, you know, what the work that Sahej and others are doing, because they're sort of messing with that, and they're messing and revealing it. And I think that's, you know, there's not enough spaces for discussions that are playful around that sort of dirt or grit, the grit in the machine, the dirt in the machine, the things that fritz out are what interests me, I guess.
It's so true, and that sort of resisting the just this sort of expose, but making it very complex. I think it's so beautiful in your work, Sahej. I did pick up that you talked about you know, that sort of sense of, is it a collaborator, is it a tool? You know, that tension there. I mean, obviously we've had the case just recently about, you know, trying to get an AI on the patent list as a creator. Love to hear your thoughts on that sense in the way that you work with AI too.
Yeah, like I think the you know, the one idea kind of that's been sort of driving me to kind of collaborate with AI in that way is you know, sort of encountering Reza Negaristani's work. Like, you know, so he kind of wrote this fantastic book that I'm still kind of like, you know, wading through, called Intelligence and Spirit, where, you know, he's basically kind of like, to reduce his argument a bit, like, you know, saying that like AI and AGI, you know, artificial general intelligence, will or is already kind of giving us this outside view to our own kind of view of the mind, you know. So it kind of just like expands the philosophy of mind, and to the point that, like, you know, we have this like kind of model that we can create, and like we can kind of and this is kind of like largely unprecedented in that sense, you know, because this has not existed. We haven't had things that can think. Beyond that, like, you know, I mean, there's work by Ian Cheng, who is like absolutely fantastic. Like, you know, when I sort of encountered his work in 2016, and I was like, you know, I mean, if art history is this game, this guy just broke it. Like, you know, he broke the game. Like, what happens after this? But also K. Alado McDowell's book, which, you know, recently, I mean, I've only had a chance to read parts of it, called Pharmaco AI, which he's kind of written. They've written with, I think, GTP3. It's sort of in collaboration with like AI, you know, and I think, and you'll see more of these gestures coming up, like even more, you know, there's this idea of like kind of treating this, these non-human forms as potential collaborators in kind of in the way that we move forward. And yeah, it's exciting, you know, like in the sense that there's this resistance to it, like, you know, as well, where people think that like, oh wait, like, you know, I mean, does that mean that like we don't need artists anymore? That's never going to be the case, you know. I mean, painting's never going to die, don't worry. But at the same time, or it's going to keep dying, you know. But at the same time, like, you know, like, this is just another tool, like, you know, I mean, the paintbrush is a tool as well, like, you know, and the pencil is a tool as well, and it's just like we've just got more tools to play with, that's all. So I mean, I just feel that resistance to technology, or even kind of like, you know, that whole idea of like, you know, art and technology, like art is technology. Like, actually, this is not something that I'm saying. Like, Holly Hendon said this, like, you know, she's like, art is technology, you and I was like, yeah, of course, that's what it is. It kind of gives us these kind of like pathways into like, into the world, into kind of like reassessing things. So yeah, like, I mean, why not have more toys to play with? So that's my approach. And I think like, I mean, I kind of have an affinity to people who are kind of like drawn towards that thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and so many of the tools now have AI just built into them. I mean, kids who are coming into the museum to learn, anything on the Adobe suite or any other photo or video manipulation tools, all of these things have those enhancements. They're just not necessarily anymore called out as AI. They're just part of how things work. It's really interesting. The GPT-3 stuff for writing is amazing. I think there's really, it'd be fascinating to have museum labels generated by GPT-3. They might even be a little more readable. Could be quite interesting, at least playful.
Noted. Doing that for the next show, obviously. Seb, you wrote late last year that obviously technology in the sector, the visual arts sector, is really different to a decade ago, and of course really different again to 2 decades ago. I wondered if we might wrap up for both of you what kind of advice you might have had for yourselves and the sector a decade ago, and what kind of advice you might give to the current generation.
I think, a decade ago, I was optimistic about where mass scale tools could take things. I'd grown up with the internet in the 1990s and had seen a utopian promise in that, which had stuck around. And I think by the early 2010s, particularly working in New York at the time of the Snowden revelations and the NSA, that really for me was a massive turning point around the utopian promise is gone, and now it is trying to find ways to bring technologies into a greater dialogue. I guess more of kind of my work is about building technological literacies and seeing those as ongoing pieces of work. It's a language that languages that evolve very, very fast. It's not like, learning Chinese and Chinese stays static and you can get a certificate. That's sort of how I think people have approached technical literacies in the past, but this is more like learning slang. It evolves at the speed of slang, and you need to find ways to think about that and think about build ways of thinking about technology as a non-sort of neutral, and also now, of course, with platform economics have come to such a global scale that it's impossible to talk about technology without also looking at how and who is making money from the technologies themselves, or from the data and from the users of that technology. And I think that's one of the things that is a real tension in, I guess, the work that I do now with museums and libraries and galleries and others is trying to bring complexity in how we think about technology. And as Sahej was saying, quoting Holly, I mean, yeah, art is technology. Technology is also part of our society in deep ways, in ways that perhaps we don't understand quite at a macro level how deep those interrelations are. And I think that's part of the challenge. And I don't know, we seem to be fragmenting as societies at a time when to address some of those issues needs us to come together in perhaps loose coalitions or decentralized organizations. I don't know, there's sort of ways that we need to find alliances in order to address some of the critical issues that are coming out, that we need to use technology well in order to do so. But in order to do that, we need to also realize where and what we're contributing to through that process. And that's why we need more artists in this space, poking at this, revealing things, showing us things that, you know, only they can see, and giving us also these physical experiences of purely digital things. I think that's the other really interesting piece with Sahej's work, and other artists too, who are working both in a digital space and with physical materials. The materiality of, you know, networks, the cloud, these are all physical things. They're made with rare earth and metals and all this sort of stuff. They are physical. There is a material layer to all this tech, which we also often don't see, and we're also often purposely abstracted for us, so we don't call into question the politics of them.
I'm so glad I'm on mute, because I'm like, yeah, here to everything you're saying. But Sahej, same to you. What kind of advice might you have given yourself 10 years ago and to artists of the future?
Play more video games. It's like, yeah. Just that. Oh, do you mean in the past or in the future?
Yeah, both. So if 10 years ago, what might you have said to yourself, knowing what you know now? And knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to artists of the future?
Yeah, I guess both ways. Like, you know, just play more video games. I think it's, yeah. Like, I mean, yeah, that's kind of what, like, I'd like to do as well. Like, yeah. But also, yeah, like, I mean, honestly, I think we're kind of seeing that already. Like, you know, I mean, like, unfolding already. Like, you know, that those worlds are converging. So, I mean, you know, in really interesting ways where it's not that clean kind of like normative sort of, you know, the digital just like kind of sitting onto, or like kind of, or like, you know, arriving as this all-encompassing thing. There's all these like kind of strange kind of things that happen, right? Like in the gaps, kind of like in Futurama, for example, like, you know, that was kind of like why that show was so fantastic as well, right? Like, because it was like, okay, it's set in the future, but at the same time, like, you know, everything's kind of falling apart, like, you know, and that's kind of where we are right now. Like, I mean, William Gibson says that, like, you know, the future is already here. It's just like unevenly placed, and you're kind of like experiencing these kind of, you're moving through those timelines constantly. So yeah, that's kind of where we are, and like, I mean, I guess like, I mean, as like, I think I mean, there's no advice. Like, I mean, I don't know. So like, you know, I mean, I would ask for advice more than anything else. But like, if I had to give any advice to myself, like 10 years back, I'd just tell myself to, like, you know, play more video games. Yeah.
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much, both of you. Such wisdom, such humour, which we all need both of in abundance at the moment. I really just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and your consideration. It's been great. Thank you.